Good morning. Welcome to Wake Up with Ashland. My name is Eric Brooks. I'm the curator here at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate. It's great to be with you again this morning. I always enjoy this opportunity to share some of the hidden stories and interesting artifacts here at Ashland, so grateful for that opportunity to be with you. Again, today I am working with my cameraman Ken. We're very grateful to the sponsor who has provided Ken. I think he's making a big difference in the quality of the presentation. You should know that this is only the second time that we've done this, so we're still working out some of the logistics of this. And so be aware there may be some challenges as we go along the way. Hopefully not too many, but if there are, that's on me, not Ken. And we'll get it figured out as we continue to do these, and I'm sure in due course they will become smoother and smoother. Those things said, today we're going to talk about a story that I promised we would talk about the last time we did this. It's a story I've actually done twice already on Wake Up, or at least mentioned. The first time was the second Wake Up with Ashland we did way back in like April of 2020. So when we started this, there was an artifact I wanted to talk about that relates to this story, and I'll show it to you later. So we talked about it somewhat then. Then the last time we did Wake Up, we looked at the firearms in our collection, and one of the firearms is directly connected to as part of the story. So I promised I would tell the full story this morning. So I am doing that now for you. And it's a fascinating story. A story of great courage, incredible bravery. It is amazing that a member of the Clay family is involved in this historic event. But it's also a story of great tragedy. And you'll see by the end of it that it has a very, very sad ending. The story we're going to tell is about that man. His name is Harry Independence Clay. Harry Independence Clay was a grandson of Henry Clay. You can see we have this beautiful portrait. We actually had this portrait conserved a number of years ago, both painting and frame. So it's really quite spectacular. And it was done by a Louisville artist named Benoni Irwin. So we'll talk about why that was. And you'll learn at the end of the presentation why this is here today in such a spectacular part of the Ash bedroom at Ashland. Harry was born in November 1849. His father was at the time charge d'affaires de Portugal, so he's serving in Lisbon. Harry is born there. His mother takes him out to a ship in harbor. Is commanded by a family friend named Charles Morgan. Morgan is commanding the U.S. Treasury ship Independence. You can see a three-masted frigate. This is a drawing of that ship that was done for Harry to show the place where he is christened. This is why he has the name Harry Independence Clay. So he's christened here. Spends his first year or so, a couple of years in Europe with his family. They come back. At that point, James purchases Ashland, tears it down, rebuilds. They move into Ashland. Harry grows up here. Now, Harry's childhood is disrupted on a number of occasions in some severe ways. He's born in 1849, so when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, he is 12 years old. So he's too young to serve, but certainly old enough to fully understand the war and its implications. He sees his eldest brother, Jimmy, goes off to war, and so he spends the war not ever really being sure where Jimmy is or what's happening to him. He has three siblings who, during the course of the first few years of the war, die of childhood illness. His father ends up fleeing to Canada, becoming a refugee from the war. His father is a Confederate. His family are Confederates. So he is without father, essentially. His mother uproots the family to go to Canada when his father becomes deathly ill. So Harry is uprooted, spends time being educated in Canada, and elsewhere. So his life stability is not great early on. This is Harry as a young man. This is a picture from our collection. This is his brother, John Cathcart Johnston Clay. He and John are close in age. John is Harry's closest sibling. They become very, very close to one another. They hang on to one another. They become the anchors through this difficult period. They need something to cling to, something to get through all of this upheaval. And they become very close. They end up becoming attorneys. And they eventually relocate to the San Francisco Bay Area, California. They open a law firm there and begin to also dabble in real estate speculation. So they're buying property and selling property, and that seems to be going fairly well. In 1872, John Cathcart Johnston Clay returns to Lexington to visit family and to deal with some real estate business that he has here. He comes home and stays with his uncle Thomas, or his Uncle Thomas's family, at their home Mansfield, which, for those of you in the local viewing area, if you go up to Shriners Lane, you got Shriners Hospital on one side on Richmond Road. On the other side, there's a lot of trees, and there's a home well back off the road. That's Mansfield. That's Henry Clay's son Thomas's home. Henry Clay built it for Thomas. That's where John stays. Unfortunately, he contracts an illness, I think perhaps typhoid, and passes away at a very young age. Now, that sets Harry back significantly. Now he's lost the anchor that he's held on to throughout most of his life. Now he finds himself looking for another port in this terrible storm. He dissolves the law practice. He begins to make his way eastward, stopping to practice law in Salt Lake City and in Denver, but is never really happy, never really feels at home. He's always alone. He is looking for some place to anchor himself. So he eventually makes his way back to Louisville, which is his mother's hometown. He has family there. He has friends there. He settles down in Louisville. He begins to practice law and becomes a prosecutor, wins an election for that, begins to ingrain himself in Louisville politics. So he is creating a life for himself. And it looks like he might be able to be successful with this, to have a career, and to enjoy living in Louisville. Around this same time, an event occurs, or events occur on the international scene, however, which will change the direction of Harry's life completely. A man named Carl Wayprecht proposes an idea for Arctic exploration. You have to understand that Arctic exploration has been going on a pretty long time. The Vikings go to Greenland about 1000 AD, so 1,000 years ago now. They're exploring that area. By the 1600s, the English are looking for a Northwest Passage, a way to get from England to the Orient. They think they can go through Canada, which is a territory owned by England, and eventually get there. So they're sending ships and men to try to find this passage. That continues on well into the 19th century. Problem is, it is incredibly dangerous. Many of these missions go and never come back. You all may be familiar with a TV show called The Terror. This TV show aired on AMC. It's aired for 2 seasons, and the first season is based on a novel written by an author named Dan Simmons. And it's a novel about a very famous Arctic expedition led by a man named Sir John Franklin. This expedition went into the Arctic in the 1840s and disappeared. No one knew what happened to it until about 10 or 15 years ago, when his 2 ships, one of which was called the Terror, were found using modern archaeological methods. So they disappeared, and everyone is lost. This keeps happening. Carl Wayprecht wants to find a way to make it safer and to eventually achieve the ultimate goal, getting to the North Pole. And his belief is that the way to do that is for the international community to establish a series of research stations in the Arctic from which expeditions can be launched, progressively moving further and further north. And through international cooperation, scientific advancement can be made. The U.S. is a little less than totally convinced, but makes efforts behind the scenes to achieve this goal. And the first expedition to attempt this is led by a man named Henry Haugen, who works in the United States Signal Office, which is the office responsible for telegraph communication in the United States military. And they're stringing telegraph lines all over the country. So he mounts this expedition in 1880. Now, the U.S. military is not deeply convinced that this is a good idea. It's not overly supportive. But he is able eventually to marshal the resources to put together a ship called the Gulnare and to raise a crew. Now, neither the ship nor the crew is particularly spectacular because he doesn't have the support that he really needs to get a good military crew and a ship designed for Arctic travel. Harry hears about this and he volunteers for service on this expedition. Why does he do this? Well, Harry is a Clay and has been taught from a young age that it is necessary to write his chapter in the Clay family story, to live up to his name. And he thinks this is a way he can do that. He can accomplish something of import, write himself into the history books, etc. And it's also a way to challenge himself. He feels a need to go out there, to adventure, to define his manliness. He has several brothers who have been in the military. He wants to show that he is equal to them. So, in May 1880, he attends a party that his friends throw, and they give him this gold badge as a token of their appreciation and of their good hopes and good wishes for him on his expedition. Now, this is actually on loan to us, but it is the badge that he was given. So he sets off, joins the expedition in Washington, and it heads north. This is a map of Canada and Greenland. You can see the dotted line goes up in between, and the goal is ultimately northern Greenland and Ellesmere Island. Now, the Gulmer, the ship that he takes, is not fit for this journey. It is not meant for travel through ice. And the end result is it is severely damaged. So the expedition is forced to halt in Greenland, near a place called Disco. There, the men of the expedition decide they need to return back. They can't get where they want to go, so they need to go home. Harry volunteers, however, to stay behind. He volunteers to remain in the Arctic, to procure provisions for when they return the next year, and to engage in scientific research that will both aid the expedition and be valuable to scholars in the future. So he stays there to overwinter. Now you have to understand, wintering in the Arctic is incredibly difficult. It gets incredibly cold. Temperatures 40 or 50 below zero easily. Sometimes much more than that. At a certain point, darkness is nearly 24 hours. So it's just a very difficult place to be, especially for someone who is not used to it. But Harry thrives. He likes the challenge. He writes voluminous notes, keeps diaries, makes all sorts of scientific observations, etc. He's enjoying his time greatly. And one of the things he does is hunt. This is his shotgun. We talked about this in our last episode. And he uses this to hunt birds, to procure as provisions for when the expedition returns. And he takes hundreds of them. He just stockpiles them away. Primarily a bird called a ptarmigan. And a ptarmigan is an Arctic bird similar to quail or pheasant. It is white, so it blends in with the snow, but he takes hundreds of birds with this gun in order to supply the return of the expedition. The other thing he does while he's there is avail himself of the opportunity to get to know the local people, the Inuit. And he's fascinated by the Inuit, finds them incredibly friendly, is deeply interested in their culture, etc. They become very friendly with him. You'll see the two flutes. Those were gifts to Henry that he brings back. Those two flutes are kind of like the ocarina that you may be familiar with from South America. They're stone, they're carved into the shape of seals. You see they've got holes on the sides so that you can generate various notes. But those come back, those are also on loan. Another thing that Harry receives is this boat. And this boat we did earlier in our series. It's a fantastic artifact. You can see it's labeled Lady Franklin Bay Expedition. That was the target destination. Lady Franklin, incidentally, is the wife of Sir John Franklin. One of the things that expeditions that went to the Arctic did was always bear in mind that there were expeditions that had come before and had never returned. So they would seek evidence of these expeditions, including John Franklin's. Anyway, this boat Harry tells us about in his papers, voluminous notes. It is called an umiak. And you'll notice there are 4 figures in the boat. You'll notice that 2 do not have things on their heads, and the other 2 do. Now, it's the 2 that have the things on their heads that are diagnostic. You'll see this photograph here. This is a pair of Inuit women. You'll notice the hair. It's exactly like the hair on the 2 figures in the boat. This boat, the umiak, is a women's boat. It's sort of the minivan of the Arctic. They would use it to move their families about, and they are identified by this top knot. Harry tells us that that's how you can tell at a distance whether a person is male or female. You can see they're wearing very heavy clothing, which makes it very difficult to determine whether they're male or female just simply by looking at the clothing. Now, it should be noted that Harry is not the only member of the Howgett expedition to stay behind. The other member is this man, Dr. Octave Pavy, a Frenchman who had been born in France, grew up in Missouri, was a doctor, medical doctor, and someone deeply obsessed with Arctic travel. He had spent years reading about, studying, and preparing for an eventual Arctic expedition. Now, Dr. Pavy had two qualities that were problematic, especially to Harry. One, he was incredibly arrogant. He believed he knew more than anyone else and should be leading expeditions, not following. The other was that he was incredibly racist. This man had a great disdain for the Inuit, had no reason or desire to have anything particular to do with them because he saw them as beneath him. This created a wedge between him and Harry that got worse when Dr. Pavy refused to treat an Inuit child who had become sick. He just didn't care enough to deal with it. The end result was that Inuit child died. This drove a wedge between Harry and Dr. Pavy that would never heal. Eventually, in 1881, in the summer, expedition returns. But it's not with Henry Howgett. By this time, it has been discovered that Howgett embezzled the money to buy the Gulnar from the U.S. government, and he's on the lam. But another man by the name of Adolphus Greely picks up the mantle. Now, he is extremely well prepared. He has spent years studying this. He covers every detail. He gets the military to provide an appropriate vessel. He gets military men. These are United States Army soldiers to undertake this expedition. So it is a much more organized, much better prepared, much better equipped expedition. They pick up Pavy and Harry and go to a place further north, Lady Franklin Bay, and establish a fort called Fort Conger. Unfortunately, not long after they arrive, Pavy comes to Greely and informs Greely that basically Greely can have either Clay or Pavy. That Pavy will not stay if Clay does. Well, this creates a tremendous problem for Greely on two fronts. First of all, he has to have a doctor. I mean, you can't do this without a medical officer. And secondly, he is being dictated to by one of his men, an inferior in the military order. And that undermines his authority. Now, most of the published sources talk about this, but they generally don't reveal the truth of what Harry does here to save this situation. They generally just say that Greely sent Harry home. Well, the fact of the matter is, Harry became aware of Pavy and his arrogant need not to have Clay around. He also realized that Greely was in a really tight spot and needed some way out of it to preserve his authority and ensure the success of the expedition. So Harry came to Greely and said, look, I'll go home. It's fine. I will leave. Pavy can stay, and your authority remains intact. You can tell everyone you ordered me home, whatever. It's fine. So Harry comes home, and he arrives back in Louisville and immediately becomes a popular fixture on the lecture circuit. He goes around showing his artifacts, telling stories and showing pictures from the Arctic. He uses a newfangled technology called the magic lantern, which is essentially an early slide projector using glass slides, the forerunner of the modern slide projector, and an early antecedent of PowerPoint. So he's doing these presentations. It becomes extremely popular. Meanwhile, the Greely expedition is engaging in all sorts of scientific research, generating mountains of data, and they actually achieve the most important goal, a new furthest north. They don't make it to the North Pole, but they send people further north than have ever gone before, taking a record from the British that the British had held for 300 years, and it never goes back. At the end of the first year, they are expecting a resupply mission. That mission never shows up because the ship sent is not, again, prepared for the ice. There's not a lot of knowledge about traversing the Arctic, and the people doing the preparing, the United States War Department, aren't really deeply concerned about it. They don't want to expend the resources truly necessary to do the right job. So they haven't listened to Greeley. Greeley prepared all sorts of instructions. They ignore them. Well, Greeley has enough resources that he can get by for another year. That'll work. So they hunker down, winter over the next year. Another resupply mission is supposed to come. They never see it. So at that point, Greeley is forced to make some very tough calls. They decide to abandon Fort Conger and move south in hopes of eventually encountering the relief vessels and or finding provisions those vessels have left behind. They continue south to a place called Cape Sabine, which again is on the eastern edge of Ellesmere Island. No relief expedition. There they do find a small cache of supplies, but it's not enough to get through the winter. So now they're in real trouble. How are they going to survive another winter in the Arctic? Well, they open up the cache and find the artifacts, the objects, the food and things wrapped in newspaper. And accounts vary. Some accounts say it was an orange, others say a lantern was found to be wrapped in a newspaper bearing this headline. That grabs the attention of Greeley and his men. And they read the article, discover it's been written by Harry Independence Clay, and it outlines in vivid detail exactly how to rescue them. And he has everything exactly right. He has laid out all of the goals and objectives exactly as they need to be laid out. So, in honor of the fact that he has done this, Greeley and his men named this location Camp Clay, and it's where they will spend their last winter in the Arctic. Unfortunately, the U.S. government does not follow these instructions. Harry had also volunteered to go on this expedition, lead this expedition. They refused his service. They didn't need a civilian interfering in a military matter. Well, had they had his services, this might not have ended as it did. So they have a year. And Harry notes that if his instructions aren't followed, that these men will lay down beneath the silent stars in the bitter cold to die. And that's essentially what happened. They create this place called Camp Clay. This is a map drawn at the rescue of the men. They build a structure using a rock wall and these wooden bars with ropes. They flip a boat over on top of it to create a sort of peak and cover it with tarps to create a sort of makeshift cabin. And that's where they winter over. Turn it upside up. Unfortunately, their food runs out in fairly short order. Within a couple of months, they're completely out of food. So they resort to eating moccasins, leather, anything that they can find, moss on rocks near the water. But eventually, even that becomes impossible. Come summer of 1884, an expedition is sent again to recover the Greeley party. When it arrives, 7 men are found alive. The other 18 have perished and have been buried in shallow graves at Camp Clay. Those 7 men are brought aboard the rescue vessels. The deceased are disinterred and brought aboard, placed in the hold. One of the men that is brought aboard dies almost immediately of gangrene. He had suffered terrible frostbite, causing loss of limbs. And when he was brought aboard the ship, the warmth of the ship caused those limbs to thaw out, and he died of gangrene, leaving 6 survivors. This is an image taken aboard one of the rescue vessels shortly after the rescue, showing the survivors and some of the crew of the ship. Greeley is right there, the man in the stocking cap. So he's one of the survivors. Now, eventually, they make their way to Newfoundland and stop in Newfoundland on the way home. And the captain of the vessel, the relief vessel, does a curious thing. He orders his crew to go into town and procure iron coffins that can be completely sealed to house the remains of the deceased. They do. The remains are sealed in these coffins, and that's how they are returned to their loved ones. Eventually, some of the families begin to ask questions. Why are our loved ones being returned to us in this manner? What happened? Excuse me. What happened? What happened over that last year? What did they endure? Greeley and the survivors are relatively reticent to talk about it. We did what we had to do. It was not good, but we made it through. And we're sorry your loved ones did not. Well, eventually, one of the families has this cast iron coffin opened to examine the remains, to try to understand what has happened. And when they do that, they make an absolutely horrifying discovery. They discover that the body of their loved one has in fact been butchered in some way, i.e. meat has been removed, apparently for the purposes of consumption. What becomes evident is that the Greeley expedition, at least some members of it, resulted to cannibalism to survive. When this matter is broached in the press, Greeley's response is basically, we did what we had to do. That anyone in the position we were in would have done whatever they had to do to survive. They don't spend much time talking about it. They pass it off as what was necessary. And it probably was. There was nothing left to eat. So they did what they felt they had to do. All of this comes about because of the arrogance of the U.S. military, the failure to follow both Greeley's instructions and Clay's follow-up. Any of those things would have resulted in the recovery of this expedition and the loss of no lives, or at least the loss of very few lives. I think 1 or 2 men died in accidents during the course of it, but the expedition would have been recovered more or less intact. It should be noted that the records of this expedition were recovered, along with a number of artifacts, and they provided tremendous information to science that had not previously been known. And of course, it achieved a new furthest north. So it did accomplish many of the things it set out to accomplish, even though it ended terribly tragically. There is a marker today near where Camp Clay was, dedicated to the men of the Greeley expedition, put there by the National Geographic Society, of which Adolphus Greeley was a founder. So they are not forgotten. In fact, there are a number of sources of information on this. There is an American Experience video that you can stream online, aired on PBS, which is very well done. There are several books on the expedition. Ghosts of Cape Sabine is one of the best known, by a man named Leonard Guttridge. This one just came out in 2019 and is called Labyrinth of Ice, and it's by a man named Buddy Levy. They're really interesting books. There are other accounts written earlier that are a little more factual or a little more directly taken from the records. These are meant to be, these are sort of popular accounts, I guess you would say, but they're very good and very well done. This one is a little sensational. I haven't read enough of this one to say for sure, but if you want to know about it, these are good sources of info. Now, they don't speak much about Harry. I don't think Harry gets the credit he deserves for what goes on. They mention Camp Clay and mention a little bit about how it got its name, but they don't really give the full story of what Harry did to try to save this expedition more than once. So that's unfortunate. And that brings us back to Harry and his story. Sadly, it doesn't have a happy ending either. In 1884, not long after the Greeley expedition was recovered, Harry went into a bar in Louisville, became intoxicated, got into an argument with the barkeep over politics and the fact that the barkeep refused to lend him $4 to buy more alcohol. He went home and got a gun. It became progressively worse. There were attempts made to disarm Harry or to de-escalate. Unfortunately, they were unsuccessful. The barkeep shot Harry and killed him. Harry was 34 years old. A life cut far too short. A life that easily could have encompassed a great deal more and a great many more accomplishments. So it's terribly tragic that this happened. And that's why the painting was done. This was done from a photograph. The family did it to commemorate Harry, who had died far too young. This was done right after he died. It was dated 1884. Interestingly, Harry's papers are at the University of Kentucky. They're in what is called the James Clay Family Papers Collection. And if you want to know about the expedition and about Harry's time, they are absolutely fascinating. They're incredibly voluminous. His journals, letters home, letters to others about the expedition, Harry's handwritten notes on how to rescue it, all of his notes about the Inuit, including the dictionary of Inuit words that he created, in which he translated Inuit to English and Latin. So it's really a fascinating source, and it's relatively untapped. I showed you some books. I don't think any of the authors who published these works ever took advantage of these papers. They haven't really been at UK that long, I mean, probably 4 or 5 years. So they may not have been available or as easily available as they are now. But it's a fascinating trove of material on this expedition and on the life of Harry Independence Clay. I'll be happy to take questions if there are any. And I hope you've enjoyed our look into this story.
What kind of materials were they wearing when they went up to the article? I mean,
So most of the materials were natural in origin. In fact, one of the things that they did was buy sealskin suits from locals in the area. Sealskin, of course, is somewhat waterproof. It's also a material that can be lined and insulated. So they're wearing a lot of the same kinds of things that the Inuit are wearing. They're taking cues from local people. So they're outfitted in that way. One of the reasons that the first resupply mission rather did not succeed is that not only was the ship not right, the crew that was sent to man it was not provided winter clothing. They were provided tropical uniforms. And even in the Arctic summer, those aren't going to work. So anyway, the U.S. military really just dropped the ball. I mean, that's just the bottom line. They just didn't do what needed to be done to save Greeley and his men.
What do you think? What was going through his mind again? Why did he take this
Harry
exhibition?
Took the expedition for several reasons. So he had suffered great loss. He had, by this point in his life, tried a number of things. Harry felt pressure to live up to his name. I mean, the Clays were raised to appreciate being a Clay, to understand that it was an obligation of being a Clay to live up to that name, to add to that name's significant reputation, etc. He wanted to write his own chapter, and he thought this was a way he could do it. He could carve his name into the history books and be remembered by being part of something that would change scientific history. Unfortunately, for things completely beyond his control, he was not able to fully participate. It is interesting to contemplate whether he would have been among the survivors had he stayed with the expedition. In some ways, I think he might have. He had a constitution and a mentality that I think he would have fought to do so, but there are no guarantees. And what they were facing was such that with his best efforts, he may or may not have been able to survive it. But he wanted to do something for himself. He also wanted to prove his manliness. He had a brother, had multiple brothers who served in the military. So he felt like he needed to live up to that. He needed to do something to show he was a manly man as well. And so this was a way to do that.
And the boats that they were sailing at the time, were they wooden boats, non-powered?
They were steam powered. They were wooden with sometimes metal exteriors, iron exteriors, the ones that were best suited to the Arctic. I mean, when you go where they're going, eventually you get far enough north that you're in ice fields. So during the warmer months, there is water and you can pass between the ice, but you're still got these huge icebergs around you. So you have to have a ship capable of getting through that and surviving potential contact with ice. And that was part of the problem. The Golden Era wouldn't do that. The relief vessels weren't well equipped for that. And so that's why they didn't make it. So they're using steamers that at the very least have iron plating, if not being made fully from iron.
Did he have any other significant moments in his life?
Well, that was certainly the last. I mean, he died right after the expedition was returned. So that was his really great achievement. That was the most significant thing that he ever did. I think had he survived, there was a great opportunity for him to continue forth in politics, continue a legal career, or perhaps engage in other scientific exploration. I don't know. But the Greeley expedition, his Arctic expedition, was by far and away the most substantial and significant thing that he did. Well, thank you for tuning in. Appreciate everyone being there today. I hope my wife and LV the cat are watching. Good morning if you are. You probably will be at some point. So thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again sometime in the near future. Once again, as always, please remember the artifacts you've seen today. You can go to our website, visit our online catalog, and there's a folder there labeled Wake Up With Ashland. The artifacts are in it. So enjoy looking at photographs, etc. Check out the rest of the catalog. Have a great day. Thank you very much.